Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 7th public event of the fall semester at Roger Williams University School of Architecture, Art, and Historic Preservation. I'm Nathan Fash, Assistant Professor of Architecture and Co-Chair of the Events Committee, along with Andrew Cohen. And tonight I'm joined by my colleague, Edgar Adams, who will be moderating our panel discussion entitled Housing Matters, Promise and Process. Our event series this semester has brought together really an extraordinary collection of voices from around the country and as far away as Rwanda in an ongoing conversation with a particular emphasis on topics of diversity and social equity. And our event tonight complements these voices by focusing our attention on the challenges and potentials of housing design and delivery rooted in our context on the East Coast. Looking ahead, I hope you'll also join us next week for a lecture by Angela Brooks of Brooks Scarpa, who will bring us a West Coast perspective on housing for quality of life and social capital. Now we're really excited to bring you our event tonight, but before Edgar introduces our guests, I want to make a logistical note about the format, which is that you as members of the audience should please feel free to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit questions either during or after the talk. And we'll pick these up at the end and read them to our guests so they can have a chance to respond. Also, we've had great luck with the internet so far, but if for whatever reason that's not the case, please just be patient and log back on. And with that, I'd like to invite Edgar to introduce our guests.
Thanks, Nate. As Professor Fash has mentioned, this lecture series is inspired by the events of this past summer that have been a stark reminder of the inequities that still exist in our society and the role played by the legacies of slavery, segregation, discrimination, unfair lending practices, and misguided housing policy in perpetuating these inequities. The persistence of this wealth gap points to an equally persistent opportunity gap, opportunity for stable and healthy housing, education, and employment. Recent housing policy has attempted to undo some of these inequities by providing greater choice and deconcentrating areas of entrenched poverty. It is the promise of increased stability and opportunity for struggling families that motivates those who work in this challenging field. However, this process of producing affordable housing is not for the faint of heart. Some would argue that architecture as a profession and the US as a nation have not devoted adequate attention to these issues of late. To help us explore these issues, we're delighted to welcome Brenda Clements to help us understand what factors are driving the need for affordable housing in Rhode Island, Michael Liu to discuss the various forms of affordable housing can take based on his extensive experience in the field, and Antonio Fiol-Silva to look at in more detail at 2 programs that are seeking to raise the visibility and profile of affordable housing in cities outside of New England. They've also generously offered to join us for a panel discussion after the presentations, so please post any questions you may have in the chat for their consideration. Brenda Clements is Director of the HousingWorks Rhode Island at Roger Williams University, which serves as a clearinghouse for information about affordable housing in Rhode Island. Prior to HousingWorks, Brenda was Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Association, and she served as Executive Director of the Housing Action Coalition of Rhode Island and Executive Director of the Housing Network. Brenda is the founding member of the New England Housing Network and served as on the board of the National Low Income Housing Coalition for 9 years and has recently completed her term as chair. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Economics from Providence College and a Juris Doctor from Washington College of Law at American University. She's received Housing Network RI Francis Smith Award in 2017, Lifetime Achievement Award in 2012 from Rhode Island Housing and the Healthy Housing Award from the Rhode Island Department of Health, and a Local Hero Award from the Bank of America in 2008. Michael Liu is Senior Partner and Design Principal at the Architectural Team. His design work has been honored by awards from the American Institute of Architects, the Boston Society of Architects, and the Massachusetts Historical Commission, among others. Michael has served as on the board of directors of Habitat of Humanity, Greater Boston, for over a decade, and has chaired the State Design Selection Board for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The architectural team is a leader in the design of multifamily housing and affordable housing, and produces over 1,000 affordable housing units a year. They have been responsible for the preservation and restoration of many important buildings, including many in the harbor area, the commercial and merchants wharves, and more recently, the award-winning Battery, Lovejoy, and Clipper Ship wharves. He's also been responsible for high-rise towers that include the Metropolitan, the Kingston, and the planned Raffles Hotel and condominiums. Michael has a Bachelor of Architecture degree from Cornell University. Antonio Fiol-Silva is the founding principal of Sitio Architecture and Urbanism and the former partner at Wallace Robertson Todd, or WRT, where we worked for a period. And his integrative work has awards and recognition from including the ULI Global Award for Excellence for the Steel Stacks Arts and Culture Campus, an AIA Urban Design Award for the U.S. House of Representatives Buildings and South Capitol Area Plan, Washington, D.C., and a Green Building Council Green Source cover feature for the Sarasville Downtown Transportation and Visitor Center. Paseo Verde, which we'll be seeing, also received the USGBC Project of the Year Award and is the nation's first LEED ND Platinum certified project. Antonio serves as a global governing trustee of the Urban Land Institute, ULI. He's been a district council chair for ULI Philadelphia, president of AIA Philadelphia, and president of the Center for Architecture and Design. He's a board member of the Association of Public Art, and he served as a commissioner in the Delaware Port Authority and the Philadelphia Historical Commission, and a board member of the Central Philadelphia Development Commission. Antonio has a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University, a Master of Architecture and Urban Design from Harvard University, and was a Fulbright Fellow in Barcelona, Spain. So I will turn it first to Brenda for her comments on the affordable housing in Rhode Island.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you again for the opportunity to come and join you this evening. I joke all the time that I'll talk about housing whether I'm invited to or not. So thanks for inviting me to talk about this topic. Housing advocates like me say all the time that the path to economic opportunity and good health outcomes and educational attainment begin at your front door. And I think that everyone, or I hope that everyone on this call would agree with me that a safe and decent house is needed by everyone in order to succeed in their life. Unfortunately, in Rhode Island, that's not always a given. And this is true. We're working with colleagues throughout the country that particularly lower wage workers that we've considered through this pandemic to be essential workers are generally the workers who are most housing insecure. In Rhode Island, nearly 2,700 men, women, and children experienced homelessness and sought shelter in 2019. As some of my Roger Williams colleagues know, we just recently released our yearly fact book last Friday, or a couple of weeks ago now, that pulls together data and information about Rhode Island in general, but also looking at statistics by community and by region in the state. And more than 146,000 Rhode Island households, or nearly 37%, are housing cost burden. our federal government, Department of Housing, the Office of Housing and Urban Development, considers you to be cost burden or housing cost burden if you're spending more than a third of your income towards housing. And as I said, over 37% of Rhode Islanders are considered cost burden. And where the other piece, and we had a housing problem in Rhode Island and really throughout New England and really throughout the country for the affordable housing end for a long time, even before COVID. But COVID has put a spotlight on a number of these issues, particularly the race and ethnicity issues and challenges and inequalities that we know we have to face and address. Rhode Island's Black and Latino homeownership the existing homeowners in that category experience the highest rate of owner cost burdenness, 43 and 41% compared to whites who are 28%. So even homeowners are cost burden in our society here in Rhode Island. The homeownership rates among Black and Latinos are, in my opinion, dismally low. They're 33 and 29%, not 29% respectively, far below the national averages for those categories and far below the white homeownership rate. So, and we know for most of us, owning something is the way that you create wealth and create equity and create some stability for your families. And so we know we've got big, huge problems to deal with there as well. 26% of Latino households in Rhode Island live in overcrowded conditions. And so the quality and condition of housing and overcrowdedness is a big, huge barrier for many individuals. We know during a time of pandemic that that's particularly a problemsome because you can't socially distance, you can't stay isolated if you're ill or sick in an apartment that you might be sharing with a number of family members and or several families, which we often see. So despite all of these challenges, the other key piece, and this again is related to COVID, but between December 2019 and June 2020, there was a 254% increase in the number of unemployed Rhode Islanders. And that was a whack and a wham. Obviously, some of the federal stimulus money helped to stabilize individuals, particularly the unemployment bump up. But we are very concerned when the moratorium that's in place from the CDC, from the Center for Disease Control, which prevents evictions and foreclosures from happening until the end of December 31st of this year. When that expires, we're very concerned in Rhode Island that we will see a very big wave of not only evictions, which is obviously impacts renters, but also foreclosures, because many of our properties, particularly our rental properties, are owned by very small landlords. And so, a renter doesn't pay or their tenant doesn't pay, that small landlord is often in the same boat as their renter is. And in Rhode Island, there's a high number estimate of eviction filings by January 2020 of 30,000, which would be an astronomical number for us. And that's an estimated range of rent shortfall of up to $119 million, which has a huge impact, obviously, on not only landlords, but also cities and towns and property taxes and ability to keep people safe during a pandemic as well. So there's lots to discuss in this area and lots more statistics that I can throw at you. I didn't do any a formal PowerPoint presentation because I always found the statistics are always so hard to manage and to look at, but our fact book and a lot of this material and information can be found on our website at HousingWorksRI.org. Happy, and if people leave a question, if they leave their email, I'm also happy to follow up with people individually about it. But I also do want to talk a little bit about quality and condition of housing, and Edgar and Nathan, please tell me when I have time's up at this point as well. But Rhode Island has some of the oldest housing stock in the country. In fact, we're tied for third with Massachusetts for the oldest multifamily housing stock in the country. And that presents a lot of unique challenges. One is we know that the condition impacts on lots of fronts. One, we know we have also an aging population. And so the ability of our seniors to age in place or age in their community in the existing housing stock is not possible and often challenging for them to do. Also difficult for them, for seniors, even seniors who might own their home, to do necessary home repairs or home modifications to keep their place and their home safe for them to stay in as well. So that's a big challenge. A few years back, we worked with the several professors in the School of Architecture and students to do a project around ADUs, or accessory dwelling units. And the students put together some great work that's also on our website that shows how accessory dwelling units could fit or could be included in typical Rhode Island housing styles. But looking at that and looking at how we can convert multifamily units into multi-generational living and units, as most of those tenement houses were used for in their history as well too, but how to convert them for people to age in place and age in community. HousingWorks also runs a project called the Rhode Island Alliance for Healthy Homes, where we coordinate and bring together all of the players who are working on quality and condition of housing. And so looking at home inspection challenges, code enforcement, lead, asthma rates, all of these issues and challenges that our older housing stock presents, and how we can put people in touch with the right resources, how we can connect them to those resources to fix and to make their home safe. Particularly during a pandemic, when we're trying to stay and when we're ordered to shelter into place or to stay in our homes, when your home is what's making you sick, or putting you at risk of the danger of a slip or fall, obviously that becomes even a bigger challenge. And so we've seen an uptick in asthma rates and other challenges in neighborhoods and communities where children are just spending more time in homes. Asthma is one of the biggest reasons for school absenteeism in the city of Providence and Central Falls, and we know it's all directly tied to the quality and condition of their housing. So we have a lot of challenges in Rhode Island. Again, a lot of challenges where that exist throughout the country. But unlike other states, we do not have a dedicated funding source and a stream of funding to produce affordable housing. I worked for about 5 years in Massachusetts and Boston for a great organization, CHAPA there. And CHAPA is the lead advocate for housing. And Massachusetts starts the discussion around investment in affordable housing in the billions of dollars, and have put in both their capital and their operating budget significant resources. Still not enough, but significant resources compared to what Rhode Island does. Right now, Rhode Island technically is out of money for production of housing, having expended the last funding and money from a housing bond that voters approved back in 2016. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of political will that needs to be developed here in the state, and we're working closely with other housing advocates and colleagues to do that as well too. But we know that part of the reason too is not just only about money, but it's also about regulatory issues, and it's about design, and which my colleagues on the call will talk more about and show some great design examples, I'm sure. But we also know that all of these things are local, and local decision makers and local laws and local zoning ordinances matter. And we also know that affordable housing has some image issues. I need to update my cultural reference, but I talk about it all the time, that we're kind of the Rodney Dangerfield of issues. We get no respect. Nobody wants us. Nobody likes us. Nobody wants it in their community. Everybody agrees. Everybody, stops at the street corner and gives the guy a couple of bucks on the who's collecting money at the stoplight. But when we talk about, okay, I want to build affordable housing in your community, that's where the discussion ends, and that's where the opposition grows and arises. So we've all heard NIMBYs and the and all of the other arguments against the cases. And so continuing to show communities by design that and other methods that this is actually a good investment, looking for ways to redesign, commercial spaces and retail spaces are changing dramatically in communities. How can we look at those as opportunities and design opportunities and combine housing and other programs in those now vacant and abandoned buildings, so they can stay on a local property tax roll and provide some needed resources like housing in a community. So that's a lot of stuff. So I think I'll stop there, but happy to add in more comments and thoughts as we go along.
So thank you. That was quite a tour. Should have asked people to buckle up first. But Michael, do you want to take it from here?
Yes, let me unmute myself first, and thank you, Brenda. That was great. I think what I'm going to do as a follow-on from Brenda is to actually give a little bit of a visual tour. What I thought we might do is just to follow on with Brenda is, because we do a great deal of affordable housing. Affordable housing is to give you a tour of the variety of forms of affordable housing. Affordable housing is a term which really encompasses a great breadth of housing types and levels of affordability and programs and demographic targets. In the United States, we really have not, I mean, the federal government hasn't been building low cost housing for decades. And so that work has been given over to advocates like CHAPA and to, by and large, to private developers. Those developers can be for-profits and not-for-profits. And the vehicles by which they build the buildings is through a variety of subsidies. Could be mortgage guarantees, could be low interest loans, could be grants, and most recently, largely through low-income housing tax credits. Edgar had expressed an interest originally, initially, in a project that we have under construction in South Boston called Old Colony. So Old Colony is a Boston Housing agency site of originally of some 842 units, which was built, I believe, in the 60s. And like many of these housing projects, was all 100% low-income housing. Many of these sites are being redeveloped as a kind of mixed income, affordable housing, mixed income projects, and usually in partnership with a developer. So in this case, there's a for-profit developer called Beacon Communities partnering with Boston Housing Authority to create 942 units in 3 phases. And you can sort of see broadly the 3 phases here. So this is, of course, projects like this take place over a decade. The 3rd phase, which you see in the background, is just now in construction documents. The first 2 phases are completed. But with a project of this size, there must be 8, 9 different funding sources that are making each individual building possible. And within that, over a period of time, it develops a whole variety of different kinds of buildings and different kinds of programs, from flats, elevated mid-rises, to walk up to, most recently, this is a 48-unit passive house apartment building in this last phase. There's also a component of home ownership. So many of these projects that I'll show you are not 100% rental, but they're a combination of home ownership, usually condominium format, and rental. these projects typically often are, as I said, they don't usually address a single slice of affordability. Usually it's a staggered, and where you have this notion of the average medium income. So you may have deep affordability for families who can only afford, say, 30% of the median income, to I say 120% and a mix. And years and years and years ago, there's when these projects were built as low-income housing projects, you had a single slice of people in a single economic strata. But the more advanced or contemporary, actually, frankly, more successful, is to mix incomes. There's a benefit across economic, social benefit in doing that. This is a different project. This is another Boston Housing Authority project that we're doing for, in this case, a private not-for-profit developer by the name of called Preservation of Affordable Housing. They're doing work across the country. We have a number of projects with them. This is the Whittier project in Roxbury. It's across the street from the Ruggles train station, and Northeastern University is sort of at the top of the page. This is an aerial view of before we became involved in the redevelopment. And this is a master plan of the redevelopment. The first phase of 92 units in the foreground is completed. The middle phase of 52 units is under construction, and the third phase, which is a high rise in the background of 172 units, is in its zoning entitlement phase right now. We hope to be entitled in about 2 months. So this is that first phase, and again, here you see in the background there's a mid-rise, all rental flats, and in the foreground are townhouses, townhomes. So townhomes, when we do them for affordable housing, are really they're larger units. They're geared to families typically. So there's obvious advantages of when you have families with children and so on, having direct entrances to the street. It also has a kind of a positive urban design effect in that it keeps the street active, people on the street. It's more secure, and there's more of a kind of a sense of neighborhood often. So we often will have a mix of these sort of townhouse formats with multiple entrances and high-rise or mid-rises. Sometimes we will embed townhouses within those taller buildings to get the same kind of street activating effect. And this is the third phase of that project, which is presently going through its zoning approval process. So these various programs, of course, often target different demographic, different programs. This is a project called Brighton Marine, and it's a veterans housing, affordable housing project in the Brighton section of Boston for a combination of anywhere from homeless vets to veterans with families, and it's a supportive housing format. So there's a social and services support aspect to this. I won't show you any programs of this kind, but there are, for example, affordable housing assisted living, which is another form of social service combined with housing. This is particularly for veterans. In the foreground, you'll notice that there's a light rail. With affordable housing, often, there's a big advantage in trying to associate it with public transportation, particularly if you get into the 30% of AMI kind of folks. To own a car and pay for the insurance and gasoline and so on, it becomes a significant part of one's income. So transportation-oriented development paired with affordable housing is something that we often try to find. And in this particular project, there's also a historic component. There was a historic campus, the Brighton Marine campus. And I'll talk about that a little bit more because there's a subsidy aspect of that, which is helpful in producing affordable housing. A different kind of client, in this case, not for profit, is our community development corporations, CDCs. This one was done in Roxbury along Blue Hill Avenue for a CDC called Nuestra Comunidad. So this little master plan had a variety of programs and phases within it. In the background, the mid-rise is affordable housing specifically for elderly. So those units tend to be smaller, small one bedrooms, 550, 600 square feet. Embedded in it are, you can't see that on Blue Hill Avenue, are duplex townhouses for 5 families within that senior housing affordable development. But in the background, then there's home ownership, which is, I think it probably seems obvious. It's where the larger buildings on Blue Hill Avenue then knit back into the kind of texture of 3 families and 2 families in the neighborhood. So it's a combination of 2 family buildings, and then townhomes as you get towards Blue Hill Avenue, the mid-rise. These again are all home ownership format affordable housing. A different client is, we do a fair amount of work with the Catholic Archdiocese of Boston. They have an affordable housing development arm called the Planning Office of Urban Affairs. And as you can imagine, the church has a lot of large campus properties, often working then with their housing arm. We developed, for in this case, the St. Kevin's School into an affordable housing project called Uphams, where there are 20 units for formerly homeless families, and then an additional 60 units of what is, in this phrase that I'm sure that everyone's heard, workforce housing, which was for a slightly higher income level. And there's a new construction component for families. There are flats. So workforce housing, and I'm sure Brenda can speak at length on this, is is meant to address a slice of the economic spectrum. Typically, is thought of as folks who are not making enough money to live in market rate units and pay those sorts of rents, but are making too much to be able to qualify for affordable housing. And that can cover, when you have this sort of staggered rent format in some of these projects, some slice of it often will address that, but often does not. There is in Massachusetts a workforce housing fund now, and this project, I believe, availed itself of that. This is that same campus, as you can see. Then, so that last slide that you saw, Upham's Crossing, is in Upham Square, which is a disadvantaged neighborhood in Boston. But these projects are often done in more affluent areas. This is a project also for the Planning Office of Urban Affairs of the Catholic Archdiocese in Brookline, Massachusetts. And it's, I'm not showing you the whole thing, but it's a campus that was developed with mid-rise townhouses and so on. But in this particular case, the actual church then was redeveloped as condominium units. I had mentioned before sort of historic buildings. So a lot of a driver, economic driver of the redevelopment and subsidy for the affordable housing projects that we do are historic renovations. So there's a historic tax credit, quite a generous one, 20% through the federal government, which of course you have to qualify for the National Park Service to do a certified historic rehab. But it's quite a significant component in a lot of the affordable housing projects we do. That tax credit is not specifically geared towards affordable housing per se, but it's often piggybacked with any number of other subsidies, often subsidies, often low-income housing tax credits, to create, to be a vehicle, an economic vehicle. This is a project in Lawrence, Massachusetts, Loft 550. And, you know, sort of this whole tax credit program, this sort of notion that if you develop according to certain standards, whether they're low income or historic preservation, you can then be granted a tax credit, which actually can be syndicated and sold and provide an important source of equity to be a vehicle for housing creation. And some of these, you know, historic buildings, of course, you get a product which you really couldn't get in new construction. And in this case, a kind of industrial interior, but can be quite spectacular, and it's affordable housing. This actually is not the same project. This is the Worcester County Courthouse, which was also historic and affordable. You know, there's an obligation for the tax credits to preserve some of these interior spaces. You can get some quite nice units. You wouldn't know that they're affordable units. One thing I did want to mention is that there are projects which are not affordable projects per se, but do produce affordable housing. And this is often associated with inclusionary housing obligations. So in most municipalities, Boston, for example, this is actually happens to be Lexington, there's an obligation on the part of the developer, as part of getting their the right to build the building, to have a certain set aside of a number of units at below market. In Boston, that affordable housing level is 70% of AMI. This is a 450 unit project in Lexington. It's a former mental hospital. There was a period of time where Massachusetts was redeveloping, having all of their mental hospitals sort of given over to private development. But, you know, if you can imagine, you know, 12 or 15% of these units becoming affordable, it becomes a significant number of contribution to affordable housing stock, which is not an affordable housing project per se. This is another similar project. This is the Danvers Mental Hospital in former mental hospital in Danvers, Massachusetts. It had a very large, sprawling, historic building, which portion was demolished and a portion kept in redevelopment, and a master plan developed with new construction. Just as an aside, actually, when I first toured this project with someone from the state, all the windows were boarded up, and it was a building that was actually 2 horror films were filmed in it. And the guy who was giving me the tour got lost. We were lost inside this labyrinth, and he started to have a kind of a palpitation. So we had to kick out a window in order to get rescued. But it's just an aside. This project is called AO Lofts, and it is a project which actually avails itself of a fund, that fund I mentioned earlier, the governor's in Massachusetts Workforce Housing Fund. I think it's a $100 million fund to support workforce housing. So that would have been at I think at a 80% or 80 to 120% of AMI economic slice. And then just, I just want to close with 2 very different projects. This is the Kensington Tower. There is no affordable housing in that tower. So there's an obligation to produce affordable housing. Some projects, the developers will opt to fund affordable housing. In this particular case, funded a project on the next block in Chinatown, the Anlock House, which was an affordable housing project for was geared towards senior folks in the Chinese community, which, but for the contribution that this project made, could not have been built. And then I just wanted to end with charities. There are charitable organizations. I think Edgar mentioned I've served on Habitat for Humanity Greater Boston for the last 16 years, where there is no subsidy except for charitable contributions in order to make them work. And Of course, that tends to be a slower process, and charitable contributions can take the place of, can be cash contributions, labor, in-kind contributions of materials, and so on and so forth. So that is just a little tour of a little piece of a very big world. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Edgar.
Thank you. I think Antonio should be queued up shortly and ready to go. But yeah, thank you for that, that tour.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Success. Okay.
Go.
Thanks. Thanks, Edgar. Thanks for inviting me to share some of our experiences. I'm delighted to be here tonight. As Edgar mentioned in the opening, in the beginning, there really is a persistent opportunity gap in all of these communities that are experiencing such housing shortages. And the COVID epidemic and everything else that has come with it has just made that so painfully evident. And clearly, it has really laid bare a housing policy that really has been fairly misguided. And Michael did a fantastic job with that amazing range of projects to describe, the process by which, whereas government before took responsibility for building housing, and maybe it wasn't always done in the best, most integrated manner. There was a production of housing that meant to keep pace with it, but that right now, by this way of sort of sending down the river the responsibility for that, you get this mind-numbing kind of series of processes. So, like Edgar said, doing affordable housing as a practitioner is not for the faint of heart. Sometimes I think it's for the faint of mind, because you wonder, it's very rewarding, but it really does burn some brain cells. So what I thought I'd do is I'd share from two projects that are really on the medium to smaller size, our experience on housing. And one of them is Paseo Verde, which you see here. This is a project that was built by Asociación de Puertorriqueños en Marcha. I'm Puerto Rican, so I can roll my R's, but it did it together with Jonathan Rose Companies out of New York. Jonathan Rose, of course, is really very well known for affordable housing projects, but often he would be developing a lot of projects in New York, like this fantastic project. It's called Villa Verde by Grimshaw Architects and Datner in New York City. But it's a tower. So he got sort of bothered by the fact of saying, well, that's all great for New York, but what about the rest of the country? So he saw this as an opportunity to team up on putting forth a vision for a lower density kind of project that could embody all of his, aspirations and values as a sustainable developer that integrates projects with the community, and then do it at a scale that it was really of a scale that you could replicate or you could envision in places like Atlanta, Washington, other cities. And this was actually Philadelphia's first project of as a podium building, which is a typology of creating a fireproof kind of podium, and then wood construction above, which is one of the most affordable ways of building housing at the highest densities, without going into more expensive areas. So as I put it together, before I launch into it, I had to confess that I was really sort of taken back. So here we are, we're doing housing, and we're not showing a single photo of the unit from the inside, the house, of housing. And I reflected on it, and you live it, but then you have to go like, yeah, really, what's going on? And the issue is that the world of affordable housing is just so highly prescribed, both by regulations and by the economics that drive these projects, that there really is a dearth of really ability to do experimentation with building typologies, or even think about all of the things that we can envision and how people can live today, in semi-shared spaces or work-live spaces, or all of these things. So any of us who involved in housing really find ourselves accepting that these are highly prescribed, often by the housing agencies and a gazillion different things, and try to look at our athletic creativity on how these projects really engage the neighborhood. And one of the really important things is that the opportunity, and I'm just reading it off because it's exactly what our organization was doing, is to create healthy housing, but also create access to education and employment. And in this project, that is it an area that the middle line there on the right is the tracks, regional rail, Temple University on one side, and this neighborhood that is in green, which is a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood that was a food desert, had no financial services, no supermarket, really degraded through the years, very degraded schools, and people couldn't see how different generations could begin to repopulate this, and there was complete sense of disinvestment. So what APM did is, the first thing is to address the idea of creating a supermarket, you know, at a time when the whole Philadelphia was a food desert. And then creating a financial institution that they brought onto the neighborhood, and then beginning to create different typologies of housing. When they were ready to really create a site that is in the yellow square as a demonstration site, it was the idea of really putting forth a vision for transit-oriented development. And when we came to it, we thought really hard that, again, you're not just creating housing, but you're really integrating a different density, a different way of thinking about how you live intergenerationally, and also the mixed incomes, and saying, how do you get the DNA of that neighborhood and the DNA physically and really culturally, and how you weave it. So as you see the diagram on the right, we were very focused on weaving the two pieces together, so that it wasn't like the one side of the tracks and then the wrong side of the tracks, which was really the perception. So what you see here is an aerial photo of the project when completed. And one of the things that I was actually yesterday, I was on an Urban Land Institute webinar with Rose Gray, the development director of APM. And when the project was completed, there were a lot of empty lots. They were formerly strewn with garbage and burnt out cars. So they started taking responsibility for cleaning them up with the Horticultural Society. And the lot of where the project was a big parking lot that the gas company used. But if you go and see the same photo taken now today, all of those lots have been infilled by private development. And the upper area, Jonathan Rose is doing the second phase of it. And she was lamenting the fact that if she could do something again, one thing she would have done is really doing the land banking, so that you could see now that once this investment came here, and it was truly a catalytic investment, whereas people didn't want to live there, didn't want to invest there, didn't even want to, the city didn't even want to put resources in education or something because they saw it as a failing neighborhood. It turned the corner and it did what it needed to do, which is to be catalytic. But at some point, the flip side of that was that it really opened the doors for that investment, and the flip side of it being, again, the displacement and all of these other things. And that's a whole topic for questions or another lecture. I'm going to try to move here fast. So what we did with the project was really create that density, but bring together a program that was a program that could integrate the community. You have to have some parking, but what you see here is a ground floor, where on the ground floor were the offices of there was some retail next to the train station because it's transit-oriented development. Then there was a health clinic that was a community health clinic that was on the big space over to the left. And then the smaller spaces on the street that hide the parking is actually a pharmacy and then a community room. And then to the left, townhouses. So the entire perimeter, except for the area up against the train, was animated with eyes on the street, as Michael had said on his projects, with courtyards, activities, and modulating the scale, and then also having larger units that are the units for larger families that were the townhouses. These are 120 units, 67 that are low income, 53 low income, 67 market rate, and the market rate has some provisions for 60% AMI. And this is the project from the street level. So whereas before it was really sort of like a very dangerous area with a parking lot, now you see that there are entrances into under the V for the organization that is APM. The other entry is the entry for the clinic, then the pharmacies next to it. And then there are a whole series of spaces that are indoor, outdoor spaces. So the project was designed as a LEED building at many levels. I go through it, but very much with the idea of health. Just like Brenda had mentioned, and this neighborhood is a very high Latino neighborhood, and the incidence of asthma is through the roof. So the whole idea of really bringing medical services and creating a healthy environment was what drove the sense of really creating this LEED environment. And if you look at here, what you see is above the podium in the wood construction laid out in the most possibly efficient way is the different bars for the project with shared elevator cores. And the core that connects it actually does the double vision of creating a sound wall for the train tracks. And idea again is to find sites that were difficult to develop and actually sort of repurpose them and find ways architecturally to make them usable. And then these green roofs that happen on the second level, and these are as wide as Philly streets, you know, are areas that are for the apartments or common areas. And then you also see the typology of offices to the left against really high buildings, the bars sort of really kind of masquerading or downplaying the density on the street, and then coming down to the townhouses, you know, which have accessible units. So this is a view again of the environment that is created, that while at the lower level, it's very urbane, once you come up from that podium, you have something where you really can enjoy the kinds of spaces that these kind of residents would only dream of in some of the streets in Philly that are very hard and not very green. And on the left is the entry area. So each one of the entries, you know, there was this sculpture element that created the entry and so on. And again, here is a diagram of the train tracks that looms over the site and the fact that it was a very difficult site in terms of sound, but making virtue out of that, the little corridors that connect the buildings, you actually have windows so you can look into these courtyards, but then one side is the courtyard, but the other side is actually these panels of different colors, you know, that are kind of pretty exuberant and sort of mark that there's something that's happening in there. And this is the train. You can actually be waiting for the elevator and look through those windows and see the train and realize you just missed one, but you can run because they run pretty. The idea of being right next to transit was huge in the day that, again, in these communities where the numbers that you're talking about, I believe you said 37%, you know, over 37% of the income. The idea not having to have a car and being able to use public transit to go to work is huge. You know, the idea not having to do that. And here's a view of the townhouses on the other side that are closer to the townhouse scale, but still at a higher density, providing grade level ADA units, but then also bigger units for the larger families. So every project, in addition for starting with the straitjacket of the fact that you can't be that creative with the units because of the standardization and all of the different regulations and the economics, you know, we dealt with the idea of really creating a LEED project. This is actually a LEED platinum for 3 categories: for homes, for mid-rise, and then also LEED for neighborhood development. But here you see in this photo, there's a green roof, there's solar arrays, and then you can see the train tracks there against the higher density of it. And then the other component was that this was the first LEED platinum project at the time in the country, and again, half of the battle was won because LEED platinum has a lot to do with creating development in places where it's served by you know, banks, markets, you know, schools and transit, but also really taking advantage of that component. I'm going to show the other. So that it was very challenging. The budget for this project, it was right after the 208 challenge. It was $143 a square foot for a LEED platinum building. It's low now. It would be more like 200. But if you think about the fact that Philadelphia is a union town and that the cost of construction are almost like New York City, it was a challenge. I'm going to show you 5 slides only to make your eyes glaze over on purpose, because the other challenge, aside from the challenge of really integrating a project and say, okay, what we really can do here is integrate the project to the community, accepting the typology of the units. And then you have the challenge of the budget and the challenge of creating a lead building, which is Jonathan Rose wanted. The biggest challenge was really the financial challenge. This is the one condo unit. So even though it's one building, is divided into the condo unit that is the affordable housing. There's the second condo unit that is really new market tax credits and all these other different grant sources. This is in the second tax unit. These are all the different grant sources that APM and Jonathan Rose went out there to find and collecting, aside from also the city was able to give the land for free. There are 19 different funding sources for that. This is the allocations within the new market tax credit. And this is the chart that I wanted to make as a mural on the lobby. And this is called the brain damage chart. But when you do a project for that, not only the architects have to be faint of heart, but the developers and the community organizations that engage in this. Because here you see the financial transactions and all of the connections and how all of this money comes together. And the issue is, as architects also, each one of these funding streams often came with their own web of regulations that a unit for this kind of organization has to be of this dimension and have this thing and these size closets and all these other things. And in the end, the irony of it all is that the legal fees for putting this together were higher than all of the design fees and all of the engineering fees together, you know. And it's really challenging. I mean, so you just really have to tip your hat to companies like that do this kind of work. Let me see how much time I have. I'm gonna go through faster through another project that we're doing right now in Detroit. This is a project where Maurice Cox, who was a former client, was the director of planning for the city of Detroit. Now he's the director of planning for Chicago, invited us to this Latino neighborhood to do a project that was La Jolla Garden, that was to be a demonstration project for the densification of corridors and his new planning approach to how you retool Detroit. The neighborhood that is in the pink area is this area that's Southwest Detroit, also known as Mexican Town, the downtown sort of in the middle. And if you zoom in, there's this corridor that is also a historic district, not that far from the Ford Innovation Center, that hadn't seen any major investment in multifamily housing in like 50 years, you know, literally. So the idea was to say that you can't make all of Detroit whole, but you concentrate on the stronger corridors with the stronger neighborhoods, and you start reinvesting and densifying those corridors, you know, which is almost counterintuitive. And this is a corridor where there's a nugget, there's a park, there's a nugget of retail that happens, but little by little, this has been eroded by parking, by strip malls. And if you walk on the streets, you find illegal things on the sidewalk, you know, and it's really kind of tough. So it's really, again, to go back there and accepting all of the regulations that you have to do in terms of the unit types and everything, but creating a building that can really engage the neighborhood. And what we thought was a challenge here, because I would say this project had two challenges: the budget challenge and the way that people would do things regulatorily. But the other challenge, as we started, was the community development that was really intense. That really was not a challenge. That was the best thing that could happen with the project. So it was a historic neighborhood, but it was a historic neighborhood that was as diverse as the community. So we went in there and really took stock of what it meant to be a historic neighborhood in a community like that in Detroit. We started having community engagements where we looked at preference surveys for the community. Sometimes we as architects approach those with a certain level of ironic detachment, but as we got into it and we see that the community was so involved into it, we took that to heart. We then developed different, and we had a really extensive community process that went way longer than our fee initially allowed or everything. We then started also laying out buildings in ways that reflected different ways in which you could live. One was a courtyard that was a protected courtyard that was internal and that you could live that way. One was maybe something that really opened up entirely into the street. And where the community ended up, out of the different versions that we had, that were architectural massings, but each one of them had a story about how you live in that building or what the values are about that building, about total seclusion and monastic and have an internal courtyard and forget that there's, you know, nasty stuff happening there, or trying to have it both ways. The project that came out is the idea that the community wanted to have a central space, which is symbolized by this green square, where the retail and the community activities huddle on that space for concentration and for protection, and you create a street frontage. And I call this very unsophisticatedly the egg scheme, right? Because you have the yolk that's very concentrated in the middle and the rest comes out there, and you try to concentrate all of your elements in one point that can really become catalytic. And these are the sketches that we showed the community throughout it for how the Central Plaza could be, how it could be integrated. And because this was a historic district, we found ourselves that, I'm almost out of time, but I'm wrapping up here. We found ourselves that there were the people who were saying, oh, we need parking here, we need parking. There was all the street parking in the world in this really wide street, but they were using the need for parking, and they were using the fact that this is a historic district as a proxy for the fact that they didn't want to see densification and what they perceived to be gentrification that may be coming with the Ford. So the Southwest Detroit District made commitments relative to who lived there, and really importantly for them, made commitments for the kind of retail that would be neighborhood-oriented retail. And what we did is we effectively hid, or for lack of a better word, or masked or ameliorated the density by putting the big ultra-efficient bar of housing in the back and creating almost a whole series of buildings in the front that talked about the formal qualities that made a historic district, the proportions of windows and proportions of retail, but not taking it too literal, and looking at the way that smaller, if you look at the top right, how smaller buildings created a rhythm and a scale in the neighborhood, and then putting the bigger building in the back, and then really being able to, my slide is not advancing, here, being able to then carve these smaller courtyards that created areas of activity. And in the middle, if you see this kind of blue area, that was a community room. That was going to be the convening space. That was going to be more like where you get your café con leche and your dona and so on, but that then in the evening could become an activity space. And the idea that space, we got inspired by the colorful area of the neighborhood, but we also got inspired by these tiles in Detroit that are glazed that are very colorful, called Poavic tiles. So in a sense, we did create a plaza, but the plaza was really long, but there was a community room in the middle, but the community room was almost conceived as an outdoor stage with garage doors on either end. And you could have a street fair and people could open up, and it would be tables in the middle selling stuff, or farmer's market. And the evening, it could become the venue for a quinceañera. And you could close one of the plazas and people could spill out on it, or it could be a community meeting. So many multifunctional things. And this is the view of it. And the neighborhood was I described the thing in the middle as a lantern or a jewel. And I use the word La Joya in Spanish. And when they had a contest for the community to name the building, they called it La Joya, and that's where the name came from. So here's the building, sort of trying to get into the scale of the neighborhood. Trying to advance here, but the computer's being slow. If you hang on in here, oops. So here's the very ultra efficient units, with a gazillion regulations about size. There's an amenity space. Advancing here. Health was also huge. This is a site that also had really high incidence of asthma. So we were really embraced healthy design because, again, there was a lot of downwind pollution. And then this was a lot of work that we did for how you could program the space in the middle. So it truly became of the community, and that was the jewel of the project. And I think in the end, and this is the last image, we went through a horrendous bossa of value engineering exercise, and we realized that to make the project work with the challenges of funding in Detroit and the fact that Detroit is a strange submarket, we basically had to take everything out of the project. And we almost also realized that you had to build it out or drive it, if not carve it, to make it work. But the interesting thing that happened is that the community had gotten so invested in creating this vision as a catalytic element that would start showing that investment, that you can't possibly build every project to the level that Jonathan Rose did with Paseo Verde, or they would do with this project. But these projects really do become a beacon for anchoring the neighborhood and creating an alternate way in which you can live that is really about again, opportunity, dignity, opportunity. So what happened here, and this is a vision, now it's not ABCXYZ, but it's called La Jolla. The name is going to go in there, and it shows how you can open the doors at night to create events and activities. And the community participation that we saw as a challenge, and almost honestly a little bother in the beginning when people started coming really hot under the collar and before they calmed down, was the one that has been our number one advocate for keeping the qualities of the project and for doing a building that was dignified for the community, you know. So and it was the one that really we can use every time we get thrown the red tape book at us, you know, and say, look, you know, the community approved this, the historic commission approved this. So the city has committed to funding. We went through a really difficult process through the summer where the project might not even have happened, and now we're racing through construction documents.
Well, thank you, Antonio. That's an amazing story and an inspirational project. And I never thought I'd hear the term affordable housing associated with or called a catalytic force for renewal, and certainly not how it's viewed in my experience. But I think it really does show what it can achieve in the right hands. And so, you know, I think, and Michael, I think certainly this demonstrating similar things with some of the projects that you showed us, which were also very inspiring. But Antonio, you mentioned this kind of fear of gentrification, and I was wondering if that was also something that that you kind of had encountered in the Paseo Verde project, and also this one, if that's something that you see as an issue going forward. And then I'll turn it over to Brenda for, I know she's dying to ask a question as well. But.
You know, certainly, you know, Rose Gray has been working on that neighborhood for 30 years, and she was there when nothing was happening. So at some point she began with the idea and a model of, frankly, I call it the Bronx model, where there was a lot of units that were torn down, and she was building these suburban style houses to solidify the neighborhood, to bring some home ownership and some stakes into the neighborhood. And she tells a story about how but it created, you know, great housing. You know, it was, again, like white siding, clapboard that looked really out of place next to the gritty Philly row homes, you know, but it brought people in there. And it's important to see this as a process that allowed her to do other projects that then were not home ownership, but also rental, with different mixes, further solidifying the neighborhood. And at the same time, she was building all these other elements. And the idea was really to create a multi-generational area so that the people who had grown up in there did not go out to the burbs or somewhere else, and maintain that community. And she tells a story about how when she went with Jonathan was upbraiding her for the kind of housing that she had done that was too suburban, and you go like, well, be my guest, you know, come and help here. Now, yes, the issue is that they have been very, they provide all kinds of homeowner financial assistance, so people understand how they can maintain ownership of their homes. When speculators come in there, they provide advice on how they, even in existing row homes, on how they can repair the houses. And now that the project is appreciating, not just sell it for money, but ride the appreciation wave in it. But she, like I was saying, she was decrying the fact that if she'd known when the land was nothing, she thought that it would be as successful, that she would have land banked this land. And now the city has some of it, but everybody wants a piece of it. And before, it was her own sandlot. Nobody wanted to go there. And she created that force and that catalytic element. And now the catalytic element is her own, she created her own Damocles sword, you know, that's coming back and really making it very hard for her to do the things that she wants to do. So gentrification is real, you know. So but they're very focused on the idea of really trying to create the financial tools by which people can understand how they can remain in place. And really, this is not my bailiwick. I'm sure Brenda is wanting to talk more about that, because this is really comes into the policy part of things, you know.
Sure, thank you, and thanks so much for the presentations. I always love to see the projects from other communities, but on our website again, housingworksri.org, we did a study around looking at gentrification issues in Providence. The report's under one of our special report tabs on there. And you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, the problem with many of the low to moderate income neighborhoods that housing developments and affordable housing developments are, is that we do need some income diversification in those neighborhoods, right? We do need to create a bigger, broader wealth of individuals in those communities. We need people who have disposable incomes who can support stores and retail spaces and other things in those neighborhoods. But how do we do that without displacing the people who are already there? And so the CDC model is to try to, with the Community Development Corporation model, is to try to help, and with other strategies around job development and job creation, to raise the income of the individuals who are already there by providing them some stable housing and a stable base in which to start to develop their life and to go further down the economic development path. But then there are other tools like inclusionary zoning and other things that we can do to make sure that there's always, and land trusts and other tools that we can use to make sure that there's always going to be a source of some housing for people at the neighborhood income level as well. So that's the challenge, right? I mean, we know we need both, but trying to do both in the neighborhoods, trying to do it. I mean, both the developers spoke eloquently about the complexity of these deals. You know, there are the number and graphics that you showed, Antonio, are very familiar to me. There are 12 to 15 funding sources, and most of the projects that are developed in Rhode Island and throughout New England, and all of those complexities that we talked about. So not only is gentrification an issue, but also density is another bad word in our field as well too, in that neighborhoods and communities in smaller cities like Providence, even Providence, but definitely in more suburban and smaller cities and towns, some of these developments that you showed pictures of are beautiful, but the density discussion would be the death of me in those communities, and they just would simply not want it in those areas. So I understand your colleague, and I don't know the woman that you were speaking about in Detroit about trying to do more suburban houses, because I'm sure it's because she was trying to respond to neighborhood opposition and trying to show that we could build less dense housing as well too. So it's a challenging subject, but you know, definitely something that that we struggled with before. I also think, particularly around density, it's going to be interesting to see how the long-term impact that COVID and the public health crisis may have. Nobody wanted bigger, you know, the image of housing and affordable housing before were big high-rise public housing developments, you know, all of the PHA designs and other designs that we saw, you know, that haven't been done for years, but that's kind of the image of issues. We've got a few of the smaller kind of family developments in Providence, like Chad Brown and Prospect Heights and Pawtucket and other places, and that's the image that people think about housing. And they just don't want that level of density in their neighborhoods and communities. And I think the COVID is going to continue to kind of feed that image problem that we know we already have.
And so, Michael, I was wondering if, you know, in terms of dealing with the whole approval process and a lot of the stigmas that are associated with affordable housing, how do you approach this issue of density, and how do you see it evolving going forward?
So, yeah, I mean, my personal view about density is, you know, with regard to the question that Brenda just brought up, is that, I mean, well, I think it's sort of ironic that all of the things that we thought were good, you know, a year ago, public transportation, density, urbanization, suddenly are bad. And personally, I don't think that they're going to be bad forever. I think people are going to eventually come back to the basic reasons why we all thought those were desirable things, and we will deal with the issue of contagion kind of separately. That whole the whole issue of density, in my experience, has changed, at least certainly in the city of Boston, where there has, over time, there seems to have been, present circumstances notwithstanding, a greater acceptance of taller, of height, per se. And there's been a kind of just as there's been a greater acceptance of a reduction of parking ratios. There's been, a noticeable, palatable sea change, like in the last 5 years, at least in the Boston area, with regard to density, and in particular with regard to height, as far as from my perspective. We will always have, a lot of convincing to do when we are working in neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods that are of an older demographic, where people are just used to a certain scale, and they're also they're not used to newcomers. And I think that will be that's always going to be an ongoing, process of persuasion that we need to go through.
I think that it will be interesting to see how COVID survives. I mean, I think the Bostons and the Philadelphias and the bigger cities are going to overcome this faster and easier, just because they're going to have to as well. But I mean, I'm more concerned about middle-sized communities like a Providence and a Worcester and a Fall River and other communities, where I just am not sure that commercial is going to come back, or that retail space is going to come back in a meaningful way in those communities. So we shall see, but we've got new obstacles in front of us, and because of the public health crisis.
Well, I think there may be some questions in the chat. I don't want to leave them for too long, but Nate, did you want to?
Yeah, sure. I can chime in with the audience's response here. So we have a couple of questions from students. First is, do you think there's a correlation between the success of an affordable housing project and the type of developer doing the project? For example, is affordable housing developed by a for-profit developer who's pursuing projects for economic reasons / tax breaks less successful than a nonprofit who's motivated by wanting to help low-income families?
I can start, and I'm sure the others may have some opinion, but I think it depends. I mean, we work very closely, and I'm certain Antonio and Michael work closely with a number of developers that are for-profit but mission focused, and so care about the communities, care about the programs, are in the deal for a long term and for a long time as well too, financially, and so want to make a project that is going to work both financially but also to serve the community. So obviously the community development corporation model, where there's more engagement and involvement in the community, is a good tool, but those projects and those developments just are never going to get to scale in a big enough way, because they're so heavily dependent on federal and state subsidies. So we need to be able to work more closely with for the for-profit community and look for ways to find more partnerships. So and I think the other important thing is the role of both the community and the city and town in where the development will be, to work closely with the community and to have set and to declare their values, if you will, about what they require of developers and what type of units they want to develop and what income targets they're going to do. So I think it's both. I think we definitely need to be, in order to be able to meet the need, to be able to work with the for-profit community, and that many of the for-profit developers that we have worked with, definitely are mission focused and care about the communities that they serve.
I would add on to that also in that, you know, there are for-profit developers of that have affordable housing, you know, significant affordable housing components who are long-term holds. I mean, they are going to have their, you know, they're not going to flip their buildings after, you know, 5 years. So they have an interest in maintaining the quality. And usually those projects also have some mix of income in them also. So a lot of those for-profit developers have a vested interest in the long-term quality, and so it depends on the developer, of course.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean,
No, go ahead, Antonio.
no, I mean, it's interesting because I've seen equally terrible projects from developers than from CDCs. When it comes to developer, our experience being the magic word mission driven, you know, a company like Jonathan Rose that are mission driven. You know, in terms of CDCs, I mean, a lot, frankly, rests on them being able to hire a skilled mission-driven architect. You know, and I say mission-driven because these projects are hard. I mean, I do market rate projects, and they're a breeze. I mean, like when you can barely ever break even. So for us, it's a labor of love. You know, just even the administrative costs. And you pour heart and soul into them because these projects tend to be more catalytic than others, you know. But sometimes, you know, CDCs really do a lot of damage, you know. So I think that we feel truly blessed in that Scenair, which is the organization in Detroit that is developing this project. They would finance it, but now they're doing development for the first time. And with this project, they are learning that we're the guinea pigs, or they say that the pioneer is the guy with the arrows in his back, and that's us in this case, because they didn't know how much it took to not just do a project, but to do a project of certain quality, where you're constantly coming on with these crazy regulations. You know, we're going back to MISHDA, which is the Michigan Housing Agency, and they have these outdated criteria for closets, where you need to put it, you know, you need to put in a snowmobile on a multifamily closet or something, and the sizes of this, and also the builders that usually build this don't have any sense of quality that is enduring, and they're trying to do this. And again, here the community was a big, but in the end, you know, when you build quality, it serves no purpose whatsoever to build junk, to use a hard word, honestly, for affordable housing, because an enduring asset is an enduring asset. You build a great building that's really simple. Doesn't mean that I have to be able to build in whistle, but it's well built, well proportioned, well conceived. You know, it's not a thrown asset. It's a building that can be used for generations, you know. The sad thing about what happened is that when all of the stock of buildings were built in the 60s, they were not thoughtful enough about how they were integrating with communities, and not built with quality in the long term. And we're trashing them. And then people say, oh, it's failed policies. But you go to Europe, or you go to places where I've seen projects in my hometown of Puerto Rico. There was a demonstration project that was built in the 30s as public housing. And it is beautiful, and it's still there, and it's gone through generations of renovations, and it was like a quality building, and that investment lasted generations, you know. So as long as we keep the sense that, you know, cheap is cheap and doesn't last, as long as we keep the sense that quality can't be brought into this discussion, then you have an asset that you're going to keep replacing again and again and again, you know.
And just wearing my policy hat too, again, the partnership between for-profit and nonprofit and mission, particularly mission-focused developers, is critical politically. You know, we need that political capital that we can get from private developers and others who do both market rate and affordable developments. We need people who will talk to their US Senator about, you know, why the low-income housing tax credit program is important, and why the federal historic tax credit is important. And so we're never going to be able to subsidize ourselves out of the affordable housing crisis in our country. And we need to figure out ways to do more public-private partnerships and utilize ways to work with existing developers or for-profit developers to do more affordable units and more affordable developments. So, you know, there are multiple reasons why it makes sense to try to work across the board.
Beautiful answers. Thank you. And one other one from a student here. So it says, I'm interested in the Ann Lynch Holmes passive house bar that Michael showed. How do you balance sustainable values with monetary considerations? How I know efficient buildings are cheaper in the long run for long term for renters, but how do you sell passive strategies at the design phase for new construction?
So there are, I mean, as time has gone on, of course, consciousness has been ever more raised in terms of sustainability issues. And speaking of sort of a mission, driven developers, I mean, there are developers who have sustainability as part of their corporate mission. In the case of passive house, I mean, we've participated in some analyses. The premium for that somewhere from what the studies that we've been shown are about 5 to 7%. But in a case like that particular case that's being brought out, of course, that project is already availing itself of a number of different subsidies and tax credit programs. And I believe in that case, there was some that were particularly geared to sustainability issues. So, so in general, I think, for example, there's one of the developers we work with, Preservation of Affordable Housing. I mentioned that before. I mean, they actively pursue, passive house as a kind of a policy position. To the extent they can make it work within the performer. Of course, there is some slight premium in, but it is again part of their mission, along with producing affordable housing. I did want to mention one sort of funny thing that has to do with getting caught up in the web of regulation, as Antonio has been talking about. There, without naming the agencies, a few years ago we had a problem where one agency had a maximum square footage allowance for units that was higher than the minimum of another agency. So, and they were both funding sources, so you couldn't actually physically satisfy both of them. But it's just a sort of a Kafka-esque example of
And
some
every
of that.
one of them has a different report form, funding deadline, everything else.
And I often think of it, Brenda, as like doing, we've got these multiple agencies with different applications and different deadlines that are often sort of contingent upon one another. So it's like doing like a 5-bank shot in pool. It's just to make it all come together, sequencing wise.
Wouldn't that be nice? We've been trying for years to get the better coordinated, and there are some improvements in the system, but still a long ways to go.
As a maybe follow up to that one, Antonio mentioned this being kind of a labor of love. I wonder if, as architects achieving successful affordable housing, how involved you are in that complex and really multifaceted funding search. And maybe can you paint a picture for us of what involvement like that, what form that involvement takes?
Kick it off, Michael?
Or after you, my friend. What did you start?
Yeah, well, I have a quote from Goethe, the philosopher, and I can't see it, but I actually put it on our bulletin board here, and it says, that creativity, it goes something to the effect that creativity is all about enthusiasm, but in the real world, it's all about persistence. And, we ended up being our own cheerleaders so that we don't get dispirited, because it starts there and we don't lose our enthusiasm for creating the vision. We ended up being the cheerleaders for the clients so that they don't go in there. I mean, this Kafkaesque web that Michael is saying about agencies that had conflicting things, and you have to thread the needle through all of these is insane, really. So it's really, it's challenging. I mean, all you have to do is just stick to itiveness. I mean, if there's like one thing is persistence, and that's what carries you through all of this stuff. And then at the other end, you look at it, and then the hardest thing is to maintain that level of enthusiasm that gives you the sense of creativity, and that level of enthusiasm that then also says that you're shooting for a good product, because otherwise it's very hard to get discouraged and then start saying, it doesn't matter, or we're not going to work that hard to get this or that achieved. I don't know, from experience, it's just really that there's no magic bullet. It really comes to that.
Great is your reward in heaven, right?
But not on earth, right? And
I
but,
think,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Well, just to build on that, I mean, I think, Nathan, you started with a question about sort of the bureaucratic process in terms of applications and so on. But in fact, to Antonio's point, one of the what can be enervating in terms of one's enthusiasm is that it's not just all of the paperwork, it's the review process, because often different agencies will have a design review that you have to go through several different negotiations. So you might have a particular idea about that you're trying to promote, and you need to negotiate with maybe 3 or 4 different design review entities with the different agencies. That's actually what can be difficult, because you wind up being negotiating between agencies.
Yeah, I think I want to make a comment that one of the things our firm is 5 years old, and we're creating a practice, and so for one, you almost think of these projects in a practice as a loss leader, because it is what you like to do. B, you accept that you're going to break even at best and maybe lose money. But the staff really gets very motivated by that, and you want to get talent, you want to get people that are mission driven themselves, and that's important from the practice point of view. Then you do the other projects that you also get motivated and so on. But frankly, it's hard to create a practice where you're dealing with these agencies day in, day out, and you lose your sense of wonder and inspiration. And there are practices out there that are like that, so at some point you have to say, like, what do you do, right? And there are the really rare practices that somehow manage to compensate their employees fairly, and manage to do incredible work, and then manage to maintain, be enthusiastic, and frankly, they're the inspiration to the rest of us, that have a practice that has different kinds of things, and I'm saying this almost as a plug, because I see that you're having Angie Brooks coming in as an upcoming, but we just like I'm looking at some of these projects that I'm just so gorgeous to see Michael's projects, in the renovation realm and so on. We find nourishment by looking at other people's and company, and looking at other people's successes, and firms like Brooks Scarpa or Aloha or other firms like that. In the West Coast, there's a lot of those firms, and here in the East Coast as well, are part of almost like a college of people that are in that same realm, and find admire others' victories, because you go like, yeah, it can be done, but it's very hard, within this Kafkaesque, I keep going back to it because it's the perfect way to describe it, that you're a cockroach in the middle of this red tape. It's very hard to maintain the level of enthusiasm to do fresh work that is really connected to the community when you have to battle these things, and it's highly rewarding in its own right, when you get to the other end of the tunnel, you see it done,
Maybe along those lines too, I wonder if maybe you could speak some more about the ways in which you engage community in your process. Perhaps also imagining that some communities may not fully exist when you're designing. But yeah, speak to it both in design and when projects are completed.
I might just pick up with there was a project I showed, which is the Kazanov site, was for a CDC, Nuestra Comunidad. And that was a very intense, it wasn't a huge project for us, but it was a very intense public process where we would have weekly charrettes we must have gone on for 15 weeks, 20 weeks, weekly charrettes with representatives of different neighborhood groups to come up with a kind of a collective design so that everyone could sort of buy in and feel some ownership in the design in the community. So what's funny is sometimes you work on projects, I'm sure Antonio's had this experience, where there'll be a major project where there's relatively little community, there seems to be little community interest in the design. And then there might be a smaller one where it's like a personal exercise, and that can be quite, actually, I mean, it can be quite exhausting, but it's also could be quite rewarding, particularly when the project's done, because everyone feels that in the neighborhood that is their building.
Well, I personally think the C and CDC's, the community engagement piece, is as critical as the development piece and the design piece. And that, you know, I know these are laborious processes, but these are buildings that are going to be in these neighborhoods for a long period of time. And so that input is critical. And no matter how long it takes, we also find that kind of very collaborative, engaging process is helpful for kind of turning around and addressing the stereotypes, right? That we know that exist. We can also, in many cases, get into the deeper issues that we know are at the back of a lot of the concerns around racism and classism. And so, I mean, it's kind of a long process, I know, but it's but there's more than design going on there, right? It's all about kind of community acceptance, community understanding, and community engagement as well too. And so it's a critical part of the process. It's a part of the process that funders all want but never fund. So the nonprofit developer or the for-profit developer has to figure out how to pay for it in the long run as well too. But to me, it makes for a better product and project in the end.
Wonderful. So we're probably stretching everybody's evening here. Edgar, do you have any closing remarks, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I just want to thank everybody for, you know, such stimulating work and discussion. I mean, I mean, I'm wondering here how Michael is even standing or sitting at this point after 30 years of doing this, or 30 plus years of doing this. But you know, I'm, you know, my admiration for all of you, all three of you, anybody who's taking this on is great, and I certainly think you've added to our students' understanding and appreciation of you know, what is possible, and also some of the challenges. But I think you know, you've given me at least, and I'm sure some of them, new inspiration for their own undertakings here. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you
So
very much. Great to see you all.
thank you for
the opportunity.
Yes, appreciate it.
Thanks again, and always happy to give a tour if anyone's coming to Providence and or any students. Always happy to show you some of the projects on the ground in our communities.
Great, and
Wonderful.
thank you, Nate, for putting this together.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. And with that, we'll call it a wrap.
Bye-bye
night.
now.
Have a good evening.
Good evening.